2-minute drill back on a Monday night. It is Jim Monaghan along with Chris Swendeman and a very, very special guest, somebody who has been instrumental in my radio career almost from the start, and that would be Richard Neer. Richard, welcome.
Welcome, James. Monongahhagen. That's what Scott Muni used to call you because you had an extra G in your name, he thought.
Richard, of course, worked at WNEW-FM and most recently WFAN. In fact, let us start with a sports question, sir. Your take on the Rafael Devers deal?
Well, I think San Francisco got the better of that deal. They needed a hitter, and he's a hitter, boy. He can make it happen there. He's only 28. The downside is it's a long contract, and a big guy like that, you figure he'll turn into a DH eventually. Luckily, the National League has a DH. But, you can never evaluate trades like that when they happen, only because the prospects, they could be great or they could be suspects,
Mm-hmm.
So if the prospects they got are good or great, then maybe it works. But if they're just also rans and they get traded 2 years later, San Francisco made the heist of the century.
The kid they're getting back, the Red Sox, this kid Tibbs, who was, I believe, a first-round pick 2 years ago. He's the one he's the one I'm most intrigued by.
Yeah, well, I have not scouted the Red Sox like you have, obviously, so I can't tell you. But he's highly regarded, and I think they like the pitcher too. But the two players that they got who are major leaguers are not so great.
Ohtani makes his return tonight on the mound. That should be must-see TV.
Yeah, are we going to be able to see it? Would that be on the baseball network?
I believe it is on the MLB network tonight. Yeah, they've been making a big deal about it.
All right. Well, I'll be tuned in.
So,
Mets and the Yankees aren't playing tonight, so I'll be watching that.
Over the past few days, I've run into a number of people who know our connection, and I'm sure that you've already heard this, but you no longer doing Saturday mornings on WFAN has left a lot of people going, what happened? I always listen to him. He was such a refreshing change from what you normally hear on sports talk radio. Take us through that process, Richard.
Well, we got a call a couple of months ago, and they said, well, we're going to make changes on the weekend. And whenever they say changes, it's usually not a good thing. So I said, okay, what kind of changes? Well, you're no longer going to be doing Saturday mornings. Oh, well, what are you putting in its place? Well, we don't know yet. Okay. So, we've been through this a number of times in radio. As you know, James, when they say they don't know, they basically saying, you stink. We don't want you around. And, whatever we put in will be better. They didn't put it that way, but that's kind of how you read it. So I said, well, I'm flexible. I mean, is there something I can do that, am I doing something, I don't know, you're doing a great job. Okay. So after about a minute of pounding my head against the wall, trying to get a reason that they're doing this, I just said, okay, well, it's your candy store. You can do what you want to do. And essentially, I think I stood out at that station as somebody very, very different from what they're doing now. And to my fans who like me, they said, you're an oasis. I think to management, I was a tumor. I was something that they had to cut out. So they did, and they said, you're still going to be at the station. We want you to do the morning show on holidays for Boomer and Geo. So I'm happy to do that. And we'll see what happens. I've been doing the mornings there for 37 years, Saturday mornings.
Wow.
So, there were a number of people who liked it and tuned in for it, and I've heard from them. But the funny thing is, I've always known this, and you know it too. As much as you think you're indispensable, 2 weeks after you're gone, people are going, what's that guy I used to listen to? What's that guy's name? Morris, Myers, something like that. So, they forget you when you're gone, and, life goes on. Oh, blah, bee.
Right? Indeed.
You know, it's funny, Richard. I heard you 2 weeks ago. I was driving actually to station, and I was listening to you, and I heard a caller call in and excited. And being a radio, growing up as a radio geek, I would have done something very similar if I called in and talked to you. He called in and he was going on for a few minutes about how he grew up listening to you, and you were so gracious about it, and you were so funny at the same time because you had said to him, I take every time somebody has said that to you, that you were so gracious about it and you appreciated it, versus Scott Muni, who you said anytime anybody said that to him, he got mad because it felt like it dated him and made him old. Like you took the high road, and apparently Scott didn't seem to have it the same way. And I just cracked up in the car laughing because I could totally see that. And you just like took me back to like radio, my radio geekdom, like growing up. And I laughed so hard in the car because I just thought that was just the funniest thing.
Well, funny thing, and I think I told the story on the air, is Dennis Elsis, when he was interviewing for NEW with Scott, he made the mistake of saying, "My mother loved your show. She grew up listening to you on ABC."
Yes.
And Scott took a little pause and he goes, "Dennis, I knew your mother." And he insinuated that it was in the biblical sense. So Dennis, of course, turned white and never mentioned that again, that his mother grew up listening to Scott's.
Well, I'm in a similar situation, though I'm older than Chris, having grown up listening to the radio station and met you through playing softball against you. I was working at a different radio station, and you were kind enough to, I guess maybe I played well. I think that's what happened. But I ended up on the NEW team, and you were kind enough to listen to some of the air checks I would give you, and ultimately gave one to Muni, who wrote on either the envelope it was in or the box, "Sounds a little like a young Pat Dawson." And I couldn't tell if that was good or bad.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Pat went on, we worked with Pat for years. We always called him Cowboy Pat because he is Richwood, New Jersey kid. And he came off as somebody out from the, gunslinger from the Old West. He went on to NBC News and he was a foreign correspondent, and he had a pretty nice career. And I called him once at NBC and I got a hold of him, and he didn't remember much about NEW. It's funny. I told him about how we produced concerts with the Grateful Dead and Springsteen and everybody. And he was like, "Yeah, I kind of remember that." So I don't know. There were a lot of, shall we say, substances going on back in the day. So not that I ever indulged, or you, we were the straight arrows. We were the beer drinkers. So we didn't get involved in that stuff.
I was too busy trying to stay in shape to play softball for the radio
There you
station.
go.
You recently did a blog post on your website, richardneer.com, and it's called, I believe, Rethinking FM, and it refers to the book that you wrote about 24 years ago now called FM, the Rise and Fall of Rock Radio. And you made a comparison between callers on FAN who would come in and, bitch and moan about the way analytics are used in radio. All right, yeah, in baseball rather. And you made a comparison between that and how changes happened on the FM dial. And I thought there were some very good comments that you made, some very good thoughts.
Well, it was, NEW, we had a good, I guess, 15 years where we could play whatever we wanted. And it was great for us. I mean, you were the show. I mean, you came in one night and you're depressed a little bit. You could play a lot of blues. You were happy. You could play a lot of rock and roll and Beach Boys and stuff. I mean, you could do whatever you wanted to do. And we all kind of took for granted that that's what radio was. And it wasn't. I mean, radio starting in the, early 60s, I guess, was heavily programmed by the program directors because of payola. They didn't want jocks taking money to play records and yada, yada. So, when it came down in around 1980, that, well, this is not just a loss leader or break even. We can make money on FM. So they brought in a consultant, and they did research, and, very crude research. It was just like, okay, what do you like? Here, we'll play songs in your headphones. Turn it up if you like it. Turn it down if you don't. And it was just very unscientific. And yet they would use that as the reason to play or not play certain records. And I remember talking to a colleague of mine who's gone on to another radio station now, a classic rock station, and they don't play Bruce Springsteen's current stuff. They won't play Paul McCartney if he has a new record on. I said, well, wouldn't you think your audience, being New York, would want to hear at least, maybe they won't like it, but maybe say, hey, I got a new Bruce Springsteen record. You don't think a classic rock audience? He goes, our research says that people don't like his music on the radio. And I said, well, when he plays the stadiums, I mean, he can sell out MetLife for, a week. Yeah, well, they like him live, but they don't like his music on the radio. So we only play like 3 or 4 songs. I said, I can't buy that. I just can't buy it. And that's pretty much what it is now, which is why you hear the same 250 songs over and over and over and over again.
I was telling Chris Swendeman a couple of days ago that there was a point, and I want to say it was 1982. I'm music director at NEW, and Fleetwood Mac releases the Mirage album. Now, this is coming off of the 2 huge albums, Fleetwood Mac and Rumors, and then Tusk, an experimental album, hit top 4. I think there were 3 or 4 singles off of Tusk. So this is a band with a track record, and PLJ wouldn't play it. And I remember the record guy coming and telling me that. I go, what? He said, no, they're not going to play the record. Like, why? Mind you, Mirage went #1 and had a few hit singles of its own. And this is, we're talking over 40 years ago. Never mind what goes on now on rock radio or any radio for that matter. And we were still at NEW. We had, you look back now, if a radio station had the kind of freedom that we as DJs had on the air, you'd think it was total freeform. How do you not play Fleetwood Mac in 1982? Let's see how the record does. I'm still floored to this day, Richard, that went on.
Yeah, and like you say, Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles were the bands. Let's throw Steely Dan in there as a personal favorite of the 70s. I mean, the late 70s. And to think that, I mean, Stevie Nicks is on tour now and selling out venues. How many years are we talking about? Almost 50 years later. It is unbelievable. And, the old creed is that you don't get hurt by what you play, what you don't play. It's only what you play. So if you play a record that's not good and people tune out, they're gone. Whereas if you don't play it, you're not taking any chances. You play with the tried and true stuff. And, I don't know how new music, new rock and roll people ever get a break if radio doesn't play them. And obviously, radio doesn't play them unless they're paid. And that's the other part of it. A record company can buy a promotional thing on a radio station and pay them, give them commercial time, and they'll play the record. In our day, that was payola. You could not do that. Well, now it's pretty common practice. And as long as they declare commercial considerations, it's okay.
Switching over to sports radio, because you started a show on WNEW-AM back in the mid-'80s called The Sports Connection. I worked briefly on it, and the guy I referred to as the other Rick Cerrone, a lot of listeners will know Rick Cerrone as the former Yankee Red Sox player, some others as well. But it was the other Rick Cerrone who had worked for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he ended up working for the Yankees as a producer. Tell us about the early days of that show, Richard.
Well, our first guest was supposed to be John Madden. And for some reason, John Madden, he didn't like to travel. So I think he didn't get into New York in time to do the show. So instead, Brent Musburger and Jimmy the Greek came, which was great. Our second guest was Hank Aaron, who I grew up loving as a my favorite baseball player ever. Rick had been working, Rick Cerrone had been working with the commissioner's office, and he knew everybody. So he started out as a producer, and he could just pick up the phone. Hey, Braves are in town. Let's get Aaron. Let's get Eddie Matthews, whoever, was there at the time. So we had a bunch of great guests, and we had a format that was pretty revolutionary. And we started doing updates every 20 minutes. We were the original 2020 sports thing. And back in the day, there was no, you didn't have sports phone. You didn't have the internet now where, you might have just heard a notification on my computer. Hey, here's a score. Here's a story. So every 20 minutes, we were given scores and updates and things. That was kind of revolutionary. And then the end of the show, we do a 45-minute interview with a big name. 3 days a week. I don't think we could pull it off 5 days a week, but 3 days a week we did that. We did a little game show, a trivia contest based on baseball or football during the football season. And we tried to think out of the box because Art Russ Jr. was around. Dave Sims, who's now the Yankee play-by-play guy, was doing a show on WNBC. So we wanted to do something different, and we were different, but I think we were on the wrong station. People want continuity, and NEW had Steve Allen, Julius LaRosa, Gene Clavin. It wasn't a sports station. It wasn't a talk station. So I think that was our ultimate downfall. And then FAN came around, and why would you tune in specifically to one station that doesn't do sports when you have it 24/7? So.
Well, wasn't there talk at one point of NEW-AM doing an all sports format?
Not that I'm aware of. It's possible. There might have been discussions at one point, but they were still hanging on with the beautiful music, the music of your life, the American songbook, they call it now. So I think that was a tradition they didn't want to let go of. And remember our old friend Jonathan Schwartz. Jonathan came in when the show was canceled, and he said, "I can't tell you how delighted I am to hear that your show has been canceled." And Rick and I are in the office, and what do you say to that? And he says, "Having said that, young Neer, I must say it is the finest sports program I've ever heard." And he walked out. That's Jonathan.
I can hear Jonathan saying that as well. Yeah. Just an absolute character.
Yeah.
Richard, a lot of times pro athletes want to be musicians, and some are actually really good. I mean, if you look at Bernie Williams, Jim on his show, All Mixed Up, plays Bronson Arroyo's album, which is phenomenal. And athletes a lot of times want to be musicians. Musicians a lot of times love sports and want to be athletes. Being somebody who covered both sides of the gamut, sports and music, did you find it easy to transition to talk about one from the other, or was it easier to talk about music or sports, or it wasn't an issue for you?
I think it might have been a little easier sports-wise, only because there were statistics, there were games, there were a lot of things that you could hook on to. Whereas music, a lot of our artists won't talk about their lyrics. Hey, well, whatever it means to you is what it means. We're not going to explain the song.
Right.
Like Bruce Springsteen, the times that I interviewed him, it's just amazing the difference between what he was then and what he is now. He's so articulate, and he's self-educated, basically. He dropped out of Ocean County College in his freshman year. And when I'd interview him, he'd go, "Oh, well, and he was terrible, And I thought it was me maybe, but it wasn't, because I've heard Mary Turner, a lot of other people interview him, the same thing. And yet he would call me when I was doing overnights, and we'd have these long conversations. They were great, and we got in depth, and yet you put a mic in front of them, no, you get nothing. So a lot of times artists, they're articulate with their music, but when it comes to speaking, not so much. Athletes can be the same way. I mean, there are a lot of athletes who are just great players, as you know, Jim, who just don't have much to say. So you gotta get lucky and catch the good ones. And I was lucky. I mean, Gary Carter was great. Joe Namath, even Terry Bradshaw. I had him in tears over the phone. We were talking about he was married to JoJo Starbuck. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
What your good taste will tell you. And they had just divorced. She had just left him and the kids and everything. And I said, well, football player and, the women and everything. Yeah. And he was like, oh, I was just my divorce. And he started crying. And it was like, I gave him a moment and, we went on to something else. But, in 45 minutes, if you can establish a rapport with people, Larry King was great at that. You could just get, and Howard Stern does it now, where you can just get them to say things that they never would tell anybody, even their closest friends. You get them into that groove and they'd forget that they were on the radio or on television and tell you some great stories. Great
Yeah,
thing.
one of the clues, to a good interview is don't ask a yes or no question. I mean, look at what happens in a Bill Belichick press conference, because he gets a lot of yes or no questions, and that's exactly the answer that he gives out a lot of times.
Yeah, yeah. I interviewed Belichick once, and we wound up talking about music. He's a big rock and roll fan. Bon Jovi, not my favorite, but he loved Bon Jovi, and he's into that whole Jersey thing, and we got along famously, and he was very articulate, very open, no monosyllabic answers. He was, spouting off about his favorite bands. But, you want to ask him about Tom Brady? I'm a Cincinnati. That was it.
We've kind of alluded to this a little bit in the conversation so far, but talk about radio stations as they change and evolve and what have you. And the subject of aging out of the demo. I am in my late 60s. I have aged out of the WFAN demo. There is no question about it. And you can hear that station going in a much younger direction with what goes on sometimes on the weekends, but especially in the afternoon drive. I hear it a lot with the two extra voices with Evan and Tiki. And I wonder if, that might be two voices too many, but nonetheless, I listen to the four of them converse. And Richard, I know I have aged out of that demographic.
Well, I'm afraid we've aged out of every demographic. We knew Madison Avenue, once you hit 54, man, you didn't count. And, when we were at NEW, we were in the demographic. We were in that 18 to 34 group, and we lived it. We understood it. We sold it. It was natural to us. And now what's natural to us is something that Madison Avenue feels they can't sell. And, arguments constantly like, hey, we have money, we buy things, we change brands, we're consumers. We still, and we have money, hopefully. But they just don't value it because they don't think we're susceptible to commercials. They think that we're kind of hip to that whole thing, and there isn't a commercial that'll make us buy something. So if you watch TV at night, which I do sometimes, watch MeTV and Heroes and Icons, watch some of the old shows, ED remedies, diseases you've never heard of. There's all kinds of pills for everything, incontinence, you name it. That's what they're aiming at us, instead of like, hey, there's a cool new electric car we might want to buy. Well, no, we don't go there. We just go toward remedies for what ails you. So
sure, because we already have our
way, James.
We have our car brand. We know what beer we drink by now. Swendeman, you're going to hit this sooner rather than later. I hate.
I'm not that far behind you guys. I mean, you talk about me like I'm one of the young kids. I'm not that young.
I got to ask you a question though. You're wearing a Yankee hat. How do you and Monaghan get along?
We get along swimmingly. He mocks me, and I take it. It's a giving relationship, Richard.
Okay.
No, we have that yin and yang, don't we, Jim? Like we have it's like two fans and two friends that just have the rivalry that we throw the jokes in and we keep it moving. I think it works.
Were it not for the Devers trade, that went down yesterday, I'd be all over him, Richard, about sweeping the Yankees and Judge going 1 for 12 with 9 Ks. Believe me. Yeah. But the Devers trade really tempered that a little bit.
Yeah.
I am the happiest person in the world that Devers got traded because anytime Garrett Cole was on the mound and Devers was at the bat, my
Boom.
phone would be buzzing and he'd be like, "Oh, is that your ace again that just got taken deep?" Yes, yes, it is, Jim.
Yes.
Thank you for bringing that up. So nobody was happier to see Dever leave Boston than I was yesterday, and I was the one that texted Jim, Richard, and I said, "Devers on his way to San Fran," and he's like, "No way." And I had to go send him proof because I'm sure after the beating they took, he thinks I'm messing with him. And I'm like, "No," I'm like, "This is actually happening." And he calls me. He's like, "You have to be kidding me." I'm like, "Nope." And I was the happiest person in the world to deliver the news to the Sox fan that Devers was on his way on the West Coast.
Mookie Betts, the list goes on and on of guys that the Sox have traded
Or
and who
sold.
traded.
Babe
Yeah.
Ruth. It goes way back. There's a
Yeah.
long history of all of this.
Yeah.
Your Riley King series. How many books are you into now with this?
Gee, I think 13. I think I don't know. I lose track. They're all behind me here, but I've got another one that's done that I don't know what I'm doing with it. I'm letting it age like fine wine. I go back to it every week or so and reread and change a few things. So I'm kind of aiming at the fall for the release of it, but it's called The Perfect Beast. You'll know where that comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically about a guy who is a divorcee and he has a website or a podcast that trashes women and talks about how women are rotten for blah blah blah, and he's got a huge following, makes a lot of money doing it, and yet it's all an act, and he's just taking advantage of misogyny, and he winds up killing a woman, and it was self-defense maybe, but
Maybe.
because of his blog they think, yeah, you finally did it. So intrigue will follow.
The Perfect Beast, of course, a reference to a Don Henley song title. And so many of your book titles are referenced off of books, including a short story that you did. I want to just wrap with this: Invisible Airwaves, a nod to Rush, if you will. I got a kick out of the radio host who was, quote, involuntarily retired, unquote. Wonder
Well,
who that sounds like.
well, the funny thing is I wrote it way before I was involuntarily retired. But it was about a guy, and you know this, like when you've been in the media your whole life and you're not really doing it much anymore, there's a certain like, am I relevant anymore? Does anybody want to hear anything I have to say? What's my purpose? Are my best days behind me? And why do you get up in the morning? You don't have a schedule, you don't have a job to go to, and all of that. So it was about a guy, an older guy, and I based it on Edward Brown. I know you remember him, a great
Yes, very well. Newsman
passed
from NEW.
recently. And it was a old journalist with a great voice and great Walter Cronkite presentation who had been let go, and he found a job at a little tiny radio station in Virginia, and he did it for a while, and then the station went under during COVID. And he continued to go in and do shows. And people thought, that, oh, he doesn't know, there's no show here. Nobody's hearing it. And he had a whole support staff around him, his daughter, his friends. And he knew the whole time that it was fake, but it gave him a reason to do something. And, I actually wrote two endings. One of the endings was he didn't know. And he was just on an illusion and just was like, oh, I'm still on the radio. And the other one was, yeah, he knew it all along and he was doing it to support his friends. So that was a cute little story.
Even with you giving away what happened there's another twist at the end that makes it even sweeter, I think, Richard. You can find that on the blog section, by the way, of Richard's website, which is richardneer.com. Richard, we're running out of time here, but I just wanted to thank you very, very much for joining Chris and me this evening. As I mentioned at the top, you are a huge part of my radio career. Helping me get started at NEW, and then all of the advice that you've given me over the years, including recently with my own involuntary retirement, if you will. So thank you for all of that.
Well, and you know, it was because you were a great center fielder in your day. The guy had speed. He could get on base. He could steal. He could do everything.
And
Except,
occasionally a good segue as well.
yeah, once in a while. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
All right. And
Good
again,
luck.
the website is richardneer.com. And Chris and I will be back next Monday night with another 2-minute drill.